Thank you very much.
Still a long way.
This chapter is going to start in Vienna. And there's a whole branch of the family that has a Viennese heritage. And there are lots of descendants who aren't here, unfortunately, but there's a whole dynasty of the Krieger Billgs. And the main feature of my presentation is going to be a film that my father took, our father, Kelly and I, Fritz, took in Vienna in around 1936. And unfortunately, I'm a heroine in the picture because there's a lot about a little baby, and that's me in the photo, in the film. But in order to give you an idea, to give you some background on the film, I have to speak a little bit about Viennese Jewry and the times, and also, of course, about my family. I'd like to just say this, that just a very brief glimpse into the history of Vienna and Jews who lived in Vienna. They came in 1420, and about every century there was like a massacre, and they would come back. And things got better and worse, and in 1669, it's very interesting, the Jews were expelled, and then the emperor immediately regretted it because he found that the Jews contributed to the economic well-being of Vienna, and he immediately called back the wealthy Jews. And it's interesting because in the early 1920s, a Jewish author by the name of Arthur Bettauer wrote a best-selling book which became a bestseller of a film. It was called Die Stadt ohne Juden, the city without Jews. And pardon? You've heard of it, okay. And it was a kind of a forecast of what would happen, except the ending was happier than the tragedy that happened. And in the book, in fact, the ruler called back the Jews because Vienna was going down the drain. And he predicted that the elegance of Vienna would be lost forever, and that people would go dressed in dirndls. It would become a purely Austrian society. Now, I want to say something about how many Jews there were in Vienna just before the war. It was nearly 10% of the population, and sociologically speaking, it's 10% that's the danger mark, usually, of tolerance, of non-tolerance. In other words, when a minority gets to be more than 10%, then more prejudice arises. However, there's always been anti-Semitism in Austria. There was tolerance, but there was also anti-Semitism. And the Jews were used to it. It was like endemic. We had to expect it. And that's the reason why many of them decided that the wave of anti-Semitism would pass and that the worst wouldn't happen. And that's why so many died. But there were 185,000 Jews in Vienna before the war. 65,000 were deported, 2,000 survived, and only 800 managed to hide and be protected by non-Jewish Austrians during the war and survived. And it was only in 1991 that Austria admitted that they had been a perpetrator and not just a victim, because when Hitler marched into Vienna in 1938, he was cheered by crowds and intellectuals and business people and ordinary people. They welcomed him. Our grandmother was just coming from the hospital where our mother had a miscarriage the day of the Anschluss. And she wrote in a diary that she saw the people standing on the terrace of the opera just cheering Hitler in. But Austria claimed to have been a victim, and it was only in 1991 that they admitted that they weren't just a victim, that they were active. So before the war, 60% of all lawyers in Austria were Jews. 50% of the physicians and dentists were Jews. 3 3 out of 4 Austrian Nobel Prize winners in medicine were Jewish. And then, of course, the names, I mean, I just have to reel them off. Sigmund Freud, Adler, Reich, Theodor Reich, Herzl, Buber, Arthur Schnitzler, Gustav Mahler, Arnold Schoenberg, Oscar Strauss, Kalman, the operetta writer, Max Reinhardt, the theater producer, Stefan Zweig, and Kafka. Kafka because he was in Prague, but it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So all these, this is just to say how Austrian Jews felt completely integrated. It wasn't just in Germany, it was in Austria. They felt total citizens, and they went willingly into the army in the First World War. I know that our grandmother prevented our grandfather on my mother's side from going into the army. She didn't have such patriotic feelings, and she convinced him not to go, but otherwise he would have gone. And of course, now I live in Italy, but I know of the war in the First World War, between Italy and Austria, and often it happened that there were Jews on both sides, and they had to shoot at each other, but it happened at times that they threw down their weapons because they recognized somebody on the other side. And Jews everywhere become patriotic in the country that they're living. And they feel part and parcel of it, so that what happened in 1938 was totally unexpected. So just a few people began to realize and managed to survive and to help others survive. And our father was one of these people. He was a philatelist, and he began our father's father had a shoe store, and the business went so-so, and our grandmother had a fur store, and there was a fire, destroyed everything, and so they struggled. However, they managed at the same time to really enjoy life. There were many things that were free in Austria, and there was a movement, a youth movement, a sports movement. You see, when you see, if you study Nazism and you see the cult for the physical body and sports, you don't realize that this was not just Nazis, it was Austrian. And there was a Jewish youth group called Hakoah, which became very famous and produced some wonderful athletes. And our family were part of this. And all 3 brothers were sports people. And our father, and then I'll get to our uncle, who is Linda's father. Our father was a swimmer, he was a ski teacher, he was a tennis teacher, he was a mountain climber.
There was a movie made.
He was a what?
There was a movie made about Hakoah.
About Hakoah, yes, about the women, right?
Yeah,
there were women, oh, I saw it. It's a fantastic film. There are women today in their 80s and 90s who still swim. And they're from all over the world, and they were part of the Hakoah club. Now, you're going to see in the movie, you're going to see a swimming pool, and I'm not sure whether this is a Hakoah swimming pool or whether it's the Viennese central swimming pool. But the whole company went there, and you can see how much they enjoyed it and how lighthearted they were and how affectionate they were with each other. They were not inhibited, you know, they were very demonstrative in the way they were affectionate to each other. And it was incredible. Our father, you can just tell from his expression, he was a different person before the war. And afterwards, he became more tense, more nervous, more easily upset, completely different. There he's carefree in the film. And the whole group is carefree. Now, our father was the oldest of the children. And he felt a great responsibility for the family. And when he was 13, he started a business by buying and selling stamps in the market on Sundays. And he built up a collection, and he built up a business. And later in his life, he published an encyclopedia of forgeries. He was an expert on forgeries. You can still find them. They're Billg's philatelic handbooks. And he took on the task of trying to help the whole family. And it was through his work that he enabled the two brothers to become engineers. And both brothers became very distinguished engineers. And Linda's father was Ernst, who was the middle son, became a nuclear physicist. And she's going to tell you more about him. I'm going to let her talk about him. But he was, of course, he emigrated to London. And he was also confined as an enemy alien, as they did in England at that time. It was ridiculous, he was Jewish, but all Germans and Austrians were put into a kind of a confinement camp. And then, of course, he was released, and he became a very well-known physicist, nuclear physicist. And the younger son, Kurt, was an engineer, and he wrote a book, and I think he has a patent on pre-reinforced concrete. And what?
Pre-stressed concrete. And he invented it, and it was under UNESCO, so he didn't get a personal patent. Just as Linda's dad worked for the English government. He
didn't get a personal patent. It was under UNESCO, but he wrote a book about it under his name. And he was president of the engineering faculty in New Delhi and in Hong Kong, of universities there. And he worked with UNESCO. Now, I want to just, this I want to say, most of the Jews in Vienna at that time had come from the surroundings, from smaller towns in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and our grandmother was one of them. Our grandmother's name was Rosa Sally, and her brother was Karl. And I brought along pictures to show you of Karl. Well, first of all, I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this? This was our mother and father on their wedding date. Okay. This is Rosa and her brother in 1899, Rosa and Karl. And Karl was Karl and Rosa were first cousins. They were first cousins of your of Joe. Yeah. They were the offspring of Marcus, who was a brother of Moritz. This is Rosa in London, where she lived, and none of us really knew her. I knew her when I was 1.5, and there are pictures of me with her. But she was an amazing woman. Here she must be around 50 or 60. She was amazing because she learned stenography at that age so that she could communicate with her 3 sons who liked to write letters in stenography because it was faster, it was time-saving. So she learned how to communicate with them, and she must have been an extremely intelligent woman. This is Uncle Karl again. He was a cook, and he was a member of the Navy in America, and he emigrated before the war. So he was here in America. This is our family. This is father, Fritz, mother. Kay is in the arms of her father, and I'm the little girl there, and that's in America. So what I wanted to say about the atmosphere that you're going to see there is that they were happy-go-lucky, although they were hardworking. But when they enjoyed themselves, they really enjoyed themselves. And you're going to see Ernst diving. He participated in the Olympics in
1928.
1928. That was before the Berlin Olympics. That was in Amsterdam. And he participated as a diver. And he won prizes also in other sports competitions. You'll see our father swimming. In Austria, there was a great pressure to integrate. And the Jews like to integrate. And you're going to see in the picture our mother and others dressed in dirndls because that was the fashion. and they felt German, they felt Austrian. Now our father, through his philately, had customers all over, and he traveled to Germany, and actually the whole film also has scenes in Morocco and Turkey, but we're not going to see that. But he traveled there. He was an amateur photographer, a filmmaker, as well as a philatelist. And my husband has published some of his photos in Italy, calling them the Billg photographic archives. But the point that I want to make is that when he went to Germany and he saw all the anti-Semitic actions there and the signs and the crowds and what was happening, he said, there's no future for us here. We have to do something about this. And so he traveled to Cuba with a colleague, stamp dealer, and they bought visas from Cuba and came back. And my mother, as I said, had this miscarriage in the day that Hitler marched in. So he marched in March, and our family, I believe, left around August in 1938. And they traveled on the Normandy, which was later destroyed. And I still have a hat box from our mother from the trip. Now, in New York, our home was kind of a harbor for all the former Viennese. They would come, and on Passover dinner, which we didn't have we didn't do the religious, we were no longer religious. Everybody was Orthodox, you know, some time ago, generations ago, but it had petered down to the central plate with all the symbols, and my grandmother would say, Guten Appetit. And we would have all the traditional food, and at the same time there were all these friends and relatives who joined us, and our grandmother, who was my mother's mother but was totally a part of the family, would be like the confidant of all the people who had problems, and they knew that she would never gossip. She would listen to them, she would help them, and we were like a place where people would come, the generation. And it reminds me a little bit, their talk was so much nostalgia for the past, and you'll see from the film why. And it reminds me very much of Isaac Bucheri's Singer, because he lived in the past. He lived in the period before the war. And these relatives, I believe, also did it, because they always talked about Vienna. I heard about Vienna all my life. People would just remember incidents. And so there was a great nostalgia. And another thing I'd like to say about our father is that he wrote out a lot of affidavits, you know, guaranteeing for people, relatives and friends. They would come over, they'd stay at our house until they found a job, and then they would go off on their own. Okay?
And he traveled around the United States with the book, the American Stamp Dealers Association book, going from door to door to people he didn't know, to ask them if they would sponsor people whom they didn't know to come, and brought over hundreds of people that way.
Did you hear that? Okay, you heard it. He did that. And he also, at the very beginning, since he had to start a new life, since when he left, he had a philatelic store in Vienna that was taken over by a Nazi. He took over the cashier. It was actually it was a man whom my father had helped in the past. But regardless, he came in, he took over the cashier, he said, now you're an employee, this is all mine. So he had to start over everything. He had stamps in the lining of his jacket and coat when he left, scared terribly that people might stop him. And that became like a lifelong kind of fear of authority, because, you know, the Gestapo was marching up and down in the trains. And but he had that small amount of stamps that came to the States, and he began looking up customers. And I remember my early years, when I was maybe 5, 6, we came over when I was 2½, and I slept on the trunks, the suitcases, in the car, because we sometimes had to go somewhere to reach the next place where he had an appointment early morning, and so we would drive at night. And then Kaylee was, even later, Kaylee joined us, and she's 7 years younger than I am. So, and so I would say that I would ask, Katie, come up.
I just want to say one thing about our mother too, because wasn't just our father. Our mother in Vienna was a concert pianist and a music teacher, and in the true tradition.
Kelly, why don't you come up here? I'm recording here.
Yeah, come on.
Yes, sister.
Okay, little sister's turn. Just I wanted to add about my mother, our mother, that in Vienna she was a concert pianist and a music teacher, and in the true European tradition, that she supported her husband first. And when they came to this country, she gave that up. She still played for friends to raise money for Hadassah and so forth. And she taught piano, but that was put very secondarily. But she was such an amazing, amazing musician, and she captured the epitome of the European, of the Viennese music. If you hear the Strauss waltzes, and if your heart is carried into just wanting to dance all around the room, that was what my mother filled our house with. From every day, she would still find a way to practice piano, play piano, and learn new things. And so we grew up with so much music, and both Lisa and I started with our mother being a piano teacher. She started us at around 3 or 4 years old, and my father would improvise. But I'm saying about music. I think music is part of the whole Billy Krieger tradition. I don't know any of the families where they don't harmonize, they don't sing, they don't make music somehow. It came into me. I rebelled. I took piano lessons from the time I was 3, and then at 13 I thought I'd rebel. So I stopped the piano, but then I picked up the mandolin, and then the guitar and the autoharp, and then eventually I ended up getting a degree in music anyway. So it's just very much part of Linda's family too. And I'm learning more and more about all of your music and how important it is to you. And it's amazing. I mean, if you think we could have all been doing this in Vienna if things had been different, and we'd have been, maybe we would have formed our own orchestra. And Ernst was an excellent violinist as well. And so the two families both had a musical background.
And those how many heard Joe play the violin? He could have made a brilliant career not playing it. People would have paid him millions not to play.
And Joe did the cello. Yes, on and on.
Linda is Ernst's daughter.